I've known some poets who've been published widely. Takes a lot of elbow grease. You have to work pretty hard sending things out. And, I've been printed. There's an industry for poetry. But for me, poetry is the greatest of pleasures, but it's also extremely rare to find a moment that has, you know, the virtues you would want from your poetry. I do have a theory of poetry. I think, the more you hear about it, you'll agree with me that it's not particularly unusual or special. And it certainly doesn't account for all of the things that can go on in poetry. And the more I've learned, the more I sympathize with the idea that it's culturally specific to me in some ways. But I've given some thought to it, and I could cite examples from my work that would show the veracity of my belief that it works well for me. And of course, I don't swear by one particular method of writing poetry. I remember being challenged by people who knew more about the craft than me in such a way as to look down on me or imply that I was not skilled, only inspired. And another thing is that poetry becomes part of your reputation, the idea that people hold about you. In fact, one might point out that I was narrowly penned as a poet in Pittsburgh public schools as a form of mockery. Something akin to liberal or naive idealist, a flute player. Once when I was looking through the small scraps of what survived of 6 bags of trash that were thrown out containing the Heaven and Hell Odyssey, I came across a crying, pained remark from when I was 15. Someone give them flutes. Helpless and pleading. The wag Fripp would probably remark. And of course, there is a super state around recognition. It gets gummed up in tars and feathers about copycats and so forth. One of the things that has served me pretty well as a poet was the idea of archetypes. You look at cigars, Dutch masters, and you see a painting by Rembrandt. Think of the old woman who lives in a shoe. It's an archetype. Mother Goose is an archetype. Rub-a-dub-dub. And certain poems became archetypes for me, such that when I lost my life's work and was homeless, it was possible for me, once I had a coffee shop to sit down in Seattle, to write almost my entire corpus from memory. This might seem like remembering a song, but it's a little different because song lyrics, a few of my poems can be song lyrics, aren't really the same as a poem. And although they should be subjected to academic scrutiny, they aren't. Dramatic readings of poems can sometimes enhance or inhibit the poetic viability of a reading. You do have to find a voice, and hearing a poet read a poem can help you find the voice. But a poet's interpretation of the voice of a poem may not match. I mean, it's often difficult to get the voice that's in your psyche when you announce poetry. At least you have the rhythm. Finding a voice in a poem is part of the art of poetry because you have to be good at reading a poem to find its voice. But archetypes and voice are two of the things I consider to be poetic devices, poetic license, and I angle for sincerity. Part of my upbringing was through the Woodstock generation, so I saw poetry as sort of protest art too. Something that brings conscience into the dimension of political things, awareness. As a result of that, a lot of my ideas were on a back burner because I didn't feel that they were called for and needed. And one of my poetic techniques is to allow that, to allow lines and phrases and scraps to become wallflowers in the background of my thoughts, and just to stay there and move around without having a final, product that you give a title and sign at the end and say this is a complete work of art. And of course, revision comes into play when you finally decide on a poetic structure to give it the best possible objective finish. Ironically, I've worked for a very, very long time on some poems and never been able to get them right. Others I got right only after a long struggle. Still others were born overnight and never changed. It wouldn't be possible to change. Wouldn't be reasonable. And then there's the fact that I had cross purposes with some rivals. So some of the dramatic intonations of some of the work were struggle with the prison of a rule, or the environment that I was in. Rhyme and meters are cool. All of the poetic devices that are in the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetics, the types of poems that exist from haiku to villanelle are cool. Poetry is playful in that way. It doesn't have to be protest by any means. There's nothing wrong with sugary love poems. I don't have it in for the common man. Poetry is graceful. It's like baseball in that way. It's just figure skating. But it's the stunted sister of the arts. I don't want to glorify one of the arts over the other, but sometimes I indulge glorification of poetry for the simple reason that it gets left out. A painting's glorified. just for being a painting. A song, the same thing. Poetry, not so much. Even the greatest poems fall by the wayside when it comes to scholarship. The most of it is a better poem, in my opinion, than The Road Not Taken, both by Robert Frost. Also, we do see echoes of similar things in works that seem to be original. For example, there's a touch of Othello in The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. This isn't to say there was anything plagiarized, just that the human condition doesn't change all that much from person to person. That's where the power of Christianity comes from, the prison of the role that we play in being mortal. Sometimes the right words come to you, sometimes you have to struggle with techniques to look for the right words. Words that can serve the purpose of what you're bringing out. And the search for who you truly are, the search for the person that you are, man's place in the solar system. Makes poetry something of a divining rod, a lens, a way of using a prism to make a spectrum to evaluate things. And of course, the more you learn about linguistics, for example, the more you realize that you're a culturally specific person. You know, I could never be one of the great minds of some of the ancient tribes who told location by direction of east, west, north, and south, because they never let go of awareness of which direction they're turned with respect to their movements. I'm much more pigeonholed into clock in the head that's Euclidean with respect to my sense of direction and so forth. But there was certainly an affinity with the mystical quest in the way that I overcame the medical injury of a brain damage, a neuroplasm that was implanted in my psyche, which is something that you would think stood separately from my poetic quest. Sensitivity, awakening sensitivity where the coma was and so forth, played a role in my poetic sensibilities. Sometimes I find poetry just a challenge and have spent a good deal of my poetic writing on exercises. Some of it has been fruitful. But I seldom call those important poems. Even if they get a better grade or wider readership or recognition, This doesn't mean that there aren't people who appreciate the difference when it comes to my work. I'm sure there must be people who could tell the difference. But poetry is a stunted sister of the arts, and I see no particularly good reason to put any of it above any of it. Save your criticisms for the things that get a lot of reinforcement.